My name is Ray Silverman. I direct the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second of a number of lectures that we are organizing this semester dealing with various aspects of museum and heritage. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sandra Dudley to the University of Michigan. She's visiting with us from the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester in the UK. Sandra comes to museum studies with a background in social anthropology, having completed her PhD in social anthropology, as well as an MPhil in ethnology and museum ethnography at Oxford University. Her anthropological research since 1996 has focused on issues of displacement and identity among the Karenni refugees from Burma, living in camps on the border of Thailand. Currently, Sandra is the program director for the master's degree in interpretation, representation, and heritage in the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester. She also teaches and supervises graduate students on topics ranging from aesthetics, dress and textiles, material culture, perceptions of art, and cross-cultural interpretation and curation. In her current research, Dr. Dudley is collaborating with neuroscientist Rodrigo Quiroga and others in developing interdisciplinary strategies for understanding people's reactions to and experiences of materiality in museums and galleries. This is a topic which we're going to be hearing more about this evening. In addition, Sandra has considerable experience working in and with museums. She served as a curator for over 10 years at one of my favorite museums, the Pitt Rivers in Oxford, where she was responsible for building and interpreting collections of textiles from Thailand and Burma. She has also done extensive research on Burmese textile collections in both the UK and the US. Her publications include her recently published monograph, Materializing Exile, the Material Culture and Embodied Experience Among Karenni Refugees in Thailand, and an anthology of essays that she recently edited, Museum Materialities, Objects, Engagements, Interpretations. Tonight's lecture considers the sensory and emotional aspects of how people experience material objects in the museum. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Dudley to the University of Michigan.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a real treat for me to come somewhere new, have a change of scene, somewhere I haven't been before, and it's such a beautiful time of year to be here as well. So I've really enjoyed my visit from that point of view. Tonight I want to talk about things and to think a little bit about the different ways in which people do and can or could experience things in museum settings in particular. I'm going to focus particularly on physical things, material objects, but that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean I'm not acknowledging that museums inevitably have other kinds of objects too and collect and interpret things that are not necessarily material artifacts, but those are the kinds of things that I'm focusing on tonight. And in terms of the word object itself, for now, I'm going to use that word as if it was essentially synonymous with the word thing or the idea of the physical thing, the artifact. But perhaps a little later in the evening, we might try and unpack and rethink a little bit about the word object and what that might mean. So to begin, I want to just think a little bit about, first of all, kind of in an introductory sense about people and things outside the museum setting. So just in a general sense, to go back to some really fundamental aspects of how we engage with objects. Then I want to think about some of the particular aspects. Is it not working?
Right, sorry. Can you hear me okay? Thank you. So we're going to start by thinking a little bit about objects in general in terms of the physical world that we all live within, and then extend that to thinking specifically in relation to museums and objects in museums, and some of the perhaps the limitations, the restrictions of the museum environment, and then extend that into thinking about two distinctive ways in which engaging quite directly with objects in a museum setting might be advantageous for museum visitors. So to begin, just to think about people and objects, people in a material world. Obviously, we all live in a material world. We engage with objects all the time. We use appliances, we wear clothes, we drive cars, we live in houses. All the time we're engaging with objects, and all the time we're doing that in an essentially physical, sensory way. We're doing that through our bodies. We're not doing it as disembodied minds. We're material too, in other words, and even the ways in which we interact with each other, with animals as well, is all part of that kind of physicality, that fundamental materiality of how we exist in the world. So when we shake hands, when we embrace, when we listen to each other, even when we try to not to intrude on each other's personal space too much, all of those things are engaging our physical senses and our entire materially present, extended in space bodies. So we're not disembodied minds. We don't float around in space. We don't float around in a vacuum. If you were an alien coming here from another planet and you were trying to understand human beings from reading lots of the social theory that you might find in a university library, you could be forgiven that we were disembodied minds floating around in a vacuum. Lots of that kind of seemingly very basic, very fundamental facts about the material world that we live in and are part of is actually absent from quite a lot of what you might read. And my contention is that it's actually absent, or at least diminished in terms of how present it could be in a lot of the scholarship that actually says that it deals with material culture. So many of you may know, I'm sure, that academic studies of material culture and of how people engage with things have been really resurgent in the last 20 years or so, more so than at any time probably since the 19th century, have people been apparently interested in objects, in material culture, and in how we as people engage with those things. But if you read a lot of that literature, fantastic though it is, and very valuable and worthwhile though it is, the fundamental physical, sensory ways in which people actually experience things, the stuff of material culture, are often surprisingly overlooked. So overlooked are both the physical ways in which people engage with and experience objects, but also the physicality of the objects themselves. So to read much of that literature, you could be forgiven for wondering where the objects actually are. That literature is so preoccupied, quite rightly in many ways, with relationships, contexts, meanings, values, representation, communication, and so on, that often the object itself seems to be lost within that literature. There are, of course, many notable exceptions, particularly, for example, in sensory culture studies, where people specifically are paying attention to those kinds of aspects of objects and how we engage with them. But the very basic fundamentals of objects, their location in space, our location in space, how those two things come together, how our eyes, our ears, our noses, our other sense organs experience those things, somehow is lost and is absent in much of that literature, despite the fact that it's clearly absolutely fundamental to how we move through the world on a daily basis and how we interact with things and with each other. So the material qualities of objects, their size, their color, their density, their shape, their texture, their their colour, and so on. All of those things have an impact on my sensory responses and your sensory responses to them. They are determinant, in part at least, of how we respond to objects and utilise and engage them in our day-to-day life. I see a green pea differently than I see a children's red ball. So far, of course, that's obvious. All of this stuff is what we do all the time. It's all pervasive in our daily lives. But, as I've said, outside sensory culture studies, and perhaps a few other notable exceptions, and some areas of aesthetics, that kind of focus is actually surprisingly slight in most studies of how people engage with the material world. Instead, to quote Paul Graves Brown, objects are present merely as a world of surfaces onto which we, as conscious beings, project significance. So why does that matter in scholarship? Why does that lack of paying attention to the physicality of objects matter? In scholarship of human culture, I think it matters because by missing out such a fundamental component of how our world and objects make the world around us what it is and make us what it is, we kind of miss out on something very constitutive of our own selves and of our own relationships with each other and with the material world around us. And in fact, that means we actually miss out on something about how we engage with and attribute meanings and values to objects, the focus which is there and so predominant in so much of material culture studies. It matters missing out that kind of fundamental, elemental focus on engagement with objects. It really matters in museums and museum studies as well. Indeed, my argument tonight is particularly that this is often a serious missed opportunity. Of course, first impressions might be that unlike in much material culture studies, or much of what I've claimed about material culture studies, that actually the object isn't missed out or overlooked in a museum. It's there, it's central. That's what museums are all about. That's what they do. We think about them as places that hold and care for and interpret and display things. Museums are temples of objects. They're material institutions par excellence. But ironically, I want to say, the very rationale, the very modus operandi of museums actually serves to limit the extent to which we can directly engage with the objects in the museum, and limits the extent to which we can understand those engagements and their potential. Most obviously, of course, one of the fundamental things that museums do, usually, is to physically distance the visitor from their objects. So we're all familiar with the way in which a glass case, ropes, please do not touch signs, ensure that we, the visitor, and the displayed object are somehow distanced from each other, are prevented from directly coming into contact with each other, into a sense of kind of intimacy with each other. That means, of course, that the kinds of interaction that objects now in museums might have had with people in the past are now lost or gone. They're not possible anymore. So the kind of intimate engagement of clothing and bodies, lips and cups, backsides and chairs isn't possible anymore once those things are selected, accessioned, and placed and conserved within a museum setting. Of course, to be fair, there are lots of limitations on our engagements with objects in life outside museums as well. So social convention dictates that it's no more appropriate for me to stroke your clothing than it would be for me to stroke something that was on a mannequin in a museum. I'd be no more likely to lick and hit and perhaps sniff a silver cup in a friend's house than I would be if it was in a museum. But becoming a museum object means that those kind of social conventions which limit our engagement with things in real life are either extended or transformed in some way, because becoming a museum object takes that thing and sets it apart from us even more clearly. But of course, despite that, sometimes when you're confronted visually by things in a museum, tapping, smelling, stroking, and so on, is often precisely what you might like to do if you could. Not least because doing that might confirm or contradict the evidence of your eyes. So we've probably all experienced, for example, in real life, that sensation you have when you pick up something which looked quite heavy, and actually it's surprisingly light. It takes you by surprise when you pick it up. Or tasting something that you thought looked really sweet, and actually it isn't when you put it into your mouth. Some of those kinds of encounters that can surprise us, that can kind of undermine or qualify the evidence of our eyes, used to be, a very long time ago in early museums, quite possible. So, for example, Constance Classen and David Howes, in a chapter that they wrote about touch in museums, recount the experience in 1702 of a woman called Celia Fiennes, who was visiting the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. She was travelling at the time, and she was keeping a diary. And in her diary, after her visit to the Ashmolean, she recorded her surprise that she had picked up a cane which looked really heavy, but was actually very light when she picked it up. So that was enough of a kind of sensory surprise for her to record that as part of her experience that day. And in those times, it was perfectly normal at somewhere like the Ashmolean so this is back in 1702, for visitors to be able to handle and pick up things as they wished. But of course, today, that kind of multisensory direct access is usually unavailable to most people. It's usually unavailable, to be honest, with most objects to everyone except a few people who work in the museum. Visitors usually have to rely just on their vision and on interpretation that might be provided by the museum in order to develop as broad a sense as possible of the museum. The trouble with the sense of vision, though, which museums often expect us to rely upon, is, as we've already seen with Celia Fiennes' walking stick, is that sense of vision can often be wrong or at the very least very limited. So, of course, I can use my eyes and I can look at something and I can form a good sense of its size and its colour and its shape and its luminosity and so on. But unless I can hold it in my hands, I can't be sure of, never mind appreciate, the weight or the density or the musicality or the coldness or the surface texture of that particular thing, depending on what it is. The silver cup, it's only if I can trace my fingers, which of course would be very damaging to the object, but it's only if I could do that, if I could trace my fingers over the incised decoration around the side of it, that I could kind of feel what that was like. And if I can, do this with my fingernails, that I can get more of a sense of the density and the musical qualities of the material that cup is made of. With the headdress covered in cowrie shells, it's only if I can hold that, not only that I get a sense of the weight of the object, as it must feel if you are wearing it, and also of the kind of glossiness and the coolness of the cowrie shells, but also if you kind of move a textile that's covered in cowrie shells like that, you have a sense of how they can affect the way it moves, that there can be a kind of ripple to the movement of a cloth that's embellished in that way. And I can't tell any of that just by looking either at a photograph like this or at the object in a glass display case. The other thing, of course, if I were able to touch these things, is not only would I be able to intuit more about their qualities and possibly about how they would have felt in use by people who would have used them. The other thing is that I can't have a kind of two-way, intimate engagement with them. Distance, the vision is a more distant kind of engagement on its own. But if I can touch something, it touches me too. It's a two-way effect. And I can't have that level of intimacy if it's behind a sheet of glass. So however museums choose to present objects, it is inherent in the very nature of what museums do that the material things displayed are almost always distanced from us in ways that don't replicate our relationships, our human relationships with things in the real world outside museums. The dominance of vision, the need to protect and conserve objects from deterioration that handling would cause, means I can't feel what the undulations of that handad's wood feels like. I can't also have a sense of incredible intimacy or a frisson of excitement in holding Henry VIII's seal and imagining him holding that hundreds of years ago. I can't do that. I can't do those things if it's stuck in a display case. That distance makes it harder for me to imagine and to empathize with, to quote Stephen Greenblatt, the feelings of those who originally held the objects, cherished them, collected them, possessed them. Of course, many institutions have explored wider sensory engagements with objects and have been using them for a long time in many ways. So education departments, for example, have long known the value of being able to touch and hold the real thing, at least in the case of objects in handling collections. Recent initiatives such as the Victoria and Albert's Touch Me exhibition in 2005 enabled people to engage very deliberately and very directly with very textural designed objects. Museums have also used touch in therapeutic work, in reminiscence work, in outreach projects. And other people are working on new digital technologies that perhaps can allow a simulation of wider sensory experience. So allow simulation of what it might feel like to touch a particular thing, a particular textural surface. But it still remains that in most cases, unlike the Ashmolean Museum at the time of Celia Fiennes' visit in the 18th century, museums remain don't touch, hands-off, visual places. Places where we are prevented from touching what other people have touched, from physically encountering the past. And to quote Klassen and Howes once more, preserving artifacts for future view, they write, has become more important than physically interacting with them in the present. There's another aspect, of course, before we move on from that, in terms of that very object stasis in museums, that very importance of conserving the museum for as long as possible in a good state in a museum. That in itself, of course, stands in significant contrast to how objects exist and how we relate to objects in the world outside museums. So in real life, if you like, we can interact with objects in ways that allow us to experience their materiality and the changes in their material states. And those very changes are themselves qualities that can enhance the meaning and the value that we attribute to objects and our understanding of not only of the objects themselves, but of their particular cultural or other contexts. But, as we've said, when things become museum objects, those kinds of object-person engagements change. There's a shift in the kind of engagements in which objects can participate, and they do become more limited. If I can't stroke my fingertips over a supplementary weft produced in goat's hair, I can't feel, not only can I not directly engage with the tangible product of a weaver's act, I can't also get a sense of how warm that object would have been made by that particular technique. I can't if I can't tap my fingernails on a bell, never mind strike it with a hammer, I can't really know what that bell would have sounded like and really understand the density of the object as well as the musicality of it, and so on. But if museum displays and exhibitions are done in a way, and they often are, or they can be, done in ways that do facilitate some kind of wider or deeper sensory or emotional engagement with the objects on display, rather than just focusing on a kind of intellectual engagement, on cognitive understanding alone, maybe that might help visitors actually appreciate more about the story that the object can tell us, as well as tell us more about the object itself, if you see what I mean. I'll expand on that in a minute. But to give you an example first of what I mean by this, there is a recent exhibition that's opened at the National Museum of Australia that's been curated by Kirsten Wenner and Martha Sear. And they spent quite a lot of effort thinking very hard at the beginning of their curatorial process how they could engage people with the objects in the museum they wanted to create in different ways than they felt had been done in their institution, the National Museum of Australia, before. The exhibition is called Australian Journeys, and it depicts, it tells stories about different processes and experiences of migration to and from Australia over time. They felt that in the past, exhibitions in their institution had not been object-centred. They'd been largely text-based. Objects had been used as kind of punctuation or just illustration, but nothing more, in wider stories which essentially were conveyed through the medium of words, not through the objects themselves. They themselves characterized previous exhibitions in their own institution as storytelling exercises accessorized by objects. And in fact, possibly that's a characterization that we could apply in quite a lot of other contexts as well. As Wenner and Sear explain, in those kinds of exhibitions, which are really pretty conventional ways of approaching museum exhibitions, objects merely illustrate stories. The actual real communication is done by something else. It's done by words, not things. They wanted to change this. They wanted to allow people to engage more directly with objects and the objects to speak more directly to the visitors. So they spent some time thinking about how they could make this possible. They wanted to allow visitors, and this is a quote from them, to rediscover the capacity of objects to inspire that slightly dislocating delight that comes from recognizing that an object was there at another time and place and is now here in this time and place in our own life. They wanted to give objects back a particularity and an excitement that directly could inspire and excite the visitor and inspire their curiosity. So they started off by choosing objects which had either particular aesthetic qualities or particular resonances because of perhaps associations with certain individuals or certain events or stories in Australian history. And then they constructed object biographies for each of those artifacts, focusing particularly on how the objects had participated in those movements of people to and from Australia that underpinned the theme of the exhibition. But they were still aware that what they didn't want to do was relay those stories, those object biographies, through large amounts of text. They wanted the objects and how the objects were juxtaposed to one another to do the bulk of the communicating. So what they did was try to facilitate what they call an intensive, interactive way of looking that gets visitors first to focus on the physical qualities of the objects, to dwell in the process of collecting sensory data, is how they put it, before reflecting on what an object might be, what it could be for, and who might have used it for what, and when, and where, and so on. They wanted to stimulate visitors' empathy and imagination in terms of responding to the other people's lives in the past that were associated with these objects. Of course, they realized they still needed to provide context to enable visitors to do this. And one of their strategies for doing that was they divided the exhibition up into 40 smaller exhibits, each of which they tried to keep textual interpretation out of the cases per se, but to just have what they call ribbons of interpretation along one side of each case only. You can see it on the second case back from the front of the picture of this part of the exhibition. There's a ribbon at the level of the bottom of the glass case which runs along just that side of the case. They also, and this is quite interesting, installed for each of those 40 exhibits what they call sensory stations, which they used to try and facilitate not just superficial explorations of objects, but more lasting, imaginative, and empathic responses to the objects and the stories that they tell. So, for example, when visitors are looking at particular objects used by Indonesian fishermen on an Australian beach, they can smell sea cucumbers. When they're looking at an old embroidered map, 19th century embroidered map, they can feel at the same time the texture of part of an embroidered map that is a reproduction of the original object in the case in front of them. So what those curators have done by using those kinds of strategies is to try and engage visitors with objects more directly and more sensually, and through those objects and those engagements to reach a state of deeper and more subtle engagement with past people, places, events, and stories associated with the objects. So they've indicated the historical uses and significances of the objects that they've used in the exhibition, but they've avoided creating sort of clear-cut, singular historical contexts for each of those objects that they could have provided adjacent to the object, perhaps largely through textual interpretation. That's precisely what they wanted to try and avoid doing. They also didn't want to pin objects down to, again, to quote them, singular times and places. They felt that to do that would close down the imaginative possibilities that the objects could offer, the chance for visitors to empathize with people in the past who may have owned and used those objects, but at the same time for visitors to recognize the subjectivity and the value in its own right of their own engagements with those objects now, in the present, in the museum. So through encouraging direct multisensorial engagements with objects, and through carefully restricting the extent and the position of their textual interpretation, they've enabled their visitors to respond to objects in their own way, and at the same time to imagine through those objects how it felt to be someone in the past. Other people have, of course, written about similarly powerful and empathic connections with objects, not necessarily deliberately facilitated through an exhibitionary strategy, as Wenner and Sear have tried to do here, but perhaps through people's very personal engagements with things, either enabled by a powerful combination of a particular object and a particular personal response to that object, and or knowing something specific about the context of that object. Andrea Whitcomb, for example, writes of the affective power that she felt when she encountered a model of Treblinka concentration camp. It's a model that's now in the Jewish Holocaust Museum and Research Centre in Melbourne. And it was handmade by a man who survived Treblinka but who lost his wife and his daughter there. This object had an incredible effect on Whitcomb, and this wasn't to do with being able to directly, sensorially, physically engage with it. The object is behind glass, just as are other models of other concentration camps which Whitcomb had been to visit. But all those other models she felt left her very numb, unlike this particular model of Treblinka. And she tried to puzzle why that was. Why did this model have a particular impact on her and cause such a strong emotional reaction? And she puts that down in this case to the fact that this particular model is a very personal rendition. It's not it's almost folksy in the way in which it's produced. It's not a polished, carefully mapped out, almost architectural reproduction, but it's something that's much more personal. It's also, in terms of how the museum have displayed it, it's given enough space that when the visitor approaches it and sees it, that you can have enough sense of distance to feel the real impact of the power of that object. As she puts it, it affects you in a visceral, physical way. And of course, there is museum interpretation placed there that allows visitors to know what the model is of and who's made it and so on. But the interpretation is done in a way which facilitates that cognitive understanding, but doesn't undermine or stand in the way of that much more direct, visceral engagement with such a powerful object. Another person who's written about very personal, powerful responses to objects is Nuala Hancock, who writes very evocatively about encountering, and this is about being in the privileged position of encountering a particular object in storage. So this isn't even something on display, but coming across Virginia Woolf's glasses in store at Charleston, the House Museum in the UK, the house where Virginia Woolf lived. Nuala Hancock writes about how she located this storage box. She unwraps layers and layers of tissue paper, and then she encounters this long black spectacle case lined in purple velvet. She takes the spectacles slowly out of the case. She ponders their form. She notices a trace of damage. She wonders about the biography of that object, how that damage came about. And then that kind of leads her into a metaphorical reflection on how Virginia Woolf saw the world, on the nature of her particular vision and her particular understanding in her own writing of the interconnectivity of the senses, and particularly of the visual and of kind of visceral responses to things. And lastly, Hancock kind of almost regretfully talks about how, although Woolf's spectacles, to quote her, offer us something tangible of Woolf's material existence, their status as something that had such an intimate relationship with someone who hated to be scrutinized leaves us feeling almost uncomfortable about intruding into the private world of somebody else's life. Now, Hancock, the way Hancock writes those personal reflections is, I find it very evocative and very moving. But of course, her reflections and the object, Virginia Woolf's glasses, and the model of Treblinka that so moved Andrea Whitcomb, both of those objects only have the power that they have and only move the person who writes about them in the way that they do because of information about them, because of their context to which we are already privileged. So because we know what the model is of, because we know whose glasses they were, that's what makes those objects have a particular power. So both those kinds of experiences and the Australian Journeys exhibition in different ways are concerned with the experiential possibilities of objects that can result from interacting directly, emotionally or physically, with objects themselves and with the context of those objects. So the objects are still telling a story. They're still part of a wider story, but they're not just mere punctuation to that story. They're doing something powerful as a communication medium in their own right. But so often it seems precisely as mere illustrators or punctuators that objects so often seem to be utilised in museum settings. And that, I would argue, beyond the distancing effect of having to protect objects and keep them away from being touched by visitors, this very use of objects as illustrators is another way, or punctuators is another way in which museums actually serve to distance people from things and to diminish the possibilities for the engagement between the two. This enables us, I think, to think briefly about what the object is and about how it's conventionally thought of. So there's a dominant view within the academy and within museums, I think, that museums are about information. And the object is a part of that, but it's only one part of that. And indeed, it's not always necessarily even an essential part of that informational culture. Now, that's a view that has a long, very honourable pedigree, and it's now an implicit part of most discussions about museums, of how most people think about museums, whether we're talking about museum learning, about curation, or about other aspects of practice. It's a view in which the object on its own is meaningless. It's valueless and it's silent unless it's placed in context, unless it's accompanied by information used to tell stories that the museum has identified as relevant and worth telling. So in this view, the object on its own is redundant, really. It only has significance as part of a package, an object information package. And in that view, some people would argue that the museum object, kind of properly conceived of, isn't just the physical thing itself. It's actually the combination of the thing and the information, the context. So to quote one of my own colleagues at Leicester, Ross Parry, the object is just a molecule of interconnecting, equally important pieces of information, only one of which, so only one of the elements in that molecule, is the material object, the material thing. That material thing is nothing in that framework of thinking without the information about it. This now conventional view of museums and objects underpins the idea that as another, part of the same dominant paradigm, that what museums do is care for and interpret historically established data sets that are comprised of objects and their documentation. Museums look after those data sets, make them available for reinterpretation by scholars in the future and for the edification of museum visitors. All of that's fine. I'm not trying to argue that it isn't. Nobody, I think now, would find it easy to argue that social, cultural, historical, scientific meanings of objects and their contexts are unimportant. Of course, they're very important, and we all know that, quite rightly, we know that. And a lot of contemporary and late 20th century scholarship has been devoted to establishing that and to establishing how crucial context is to interpretive theory and practice in museums and elsewhere. But my argument is that museums and visitors alike, not just the museums, it's those of us who go to them as well, we're so concerned with information, we're so keen to emphasize that information value, that aspect of objects, the story that overlies the physical thing, that unfortunately that can inadvertently close off other, perhaps equally significant potentials of things. So if people are so concerned with the story that an object has to tell, and I repeat, I'm not claiming that there is anything wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with using objects to tell stories and to place, and nothing wrong with placing them in context. But if we are so preoccupied with doing that, that becomes the sole focus both of the museum endeavour and of the visitor objective, we risk precluding or shutting off or foreclosing other possible responses that people can have to objects as a result of physical, real-time, sensory experience of the objects that people see before them when they go to a museum. In other words, we risk missing out what could be argued to be the power of the object itself. In some ways, maybe that allows us to rethink slightly what we mean by the object. So if I've just said and quoted my colleague Ross Parry, if an object on the one hand is thought about as a kind of composite of the material thing and its context, the information about it, and that is one valid way to conceive of what we mean by object. Perhaps another way, which might be an equally valid way to think about it, is it's still a composite, but this time it's a composite of the material thing and the response or the engagement which people are able to have at a fundamental level with that thing, even if they don't know anything about it. So I'll give an example of what I mean in a minute. So in a museum context, what this means is that the contemporary paradigms that tell us that interpretation is subjective, that meaning is in the eye of the beholder, are not wrong. That kind of thinking that enables museums to think creatively about how they interpret objects and tell stories, that's all really constructive. Perception and interpretation are subjective. Your eyes, my eyes, work the same at a neurological level. But what we do with the sensory data that comes from our sense organs is different for each of us, because it's how we interpret that data is influenced by our cultural backgrounds, our personal backgrounds, the particular level of expertise or interest that we bring to the setting, and so on. So our personal baggage determines how we perceive and respond to objects and to their contexts. It is in the eye of the beholder, but only partly, because objects too have an impact, an effect on how we respond. They have agency and power in the process of engagement between us and them. That's true in real life on an everyday basis. Chris Gosden almost goes so far as to suggest that perhaps even it's objects that control, in a sense, the material world in which we live. To quote him, people crystallize out in the interstices between objects, taking up the space allowed them in the object world, with their senses and their emotions educated by the object world. What that means is that while how we interpret the evidence of our senses is subjective and dependent on what we are told and know about the context of an object and on our own particular backgrounds and expertise and so on, the object itself at a physical level also has a big impact on how we experience it. That's very obvious on one level. So particular material qualities of that object will determine how we respond to it in terms of its color, its shape, and so on. But it's something that if we push that thinking a little bit further, that maybe in museums, the two-way engagement that I'm trying to suggest happens between person and object is something that we could exploit and that we could enable to become as material and as sensory an engagement as possible. And I think that if we do that, we can enrich the ways in which people understand stories and contexts of objects in the way that Wenner and Sear have tried to do in their Australian Journeys exhibition. But actually, I think that we can also do it for another reason, and that is to accept the value of the encounter with the object in and of itself before, or even if we know nothing about it at all. Now, to even hint at that or start talking about that, to start talking about the power of an engagement with an object that you have no sense of and that has no meaning for you and you have no information about, that's quite problematic for lots of people. It is a view that some people have, again, Kavanagh would argue that that's kind of obfuscating what objects are about, and that objects don't have any voice of their own, they don't have anything to say. That's the conventional argument. Objects are mute without context. And on one level, of course, that's true, and I would accept that. But on another level, I'm not sure that that's entirely the case. And I'm not talking about a detached, kind of elitist, Kantian aesthetic response to objects. I'm not talking about that as the alternative to engaging with context and information. In fact, I'm trying to get at something else, which is the scope for very personal, very individual, very subjective, very physical, very emotional responses to material things. Responses that actually, they won't always happen, but that when they do, they have the potential to be very, very powerful indeed. But they're so often inhibited by so much of what museums do and are expected to do. These are very different kinds of response that I'm talking about to the kinds of responses that are elicited by the conventional foregrounding of objects as illustrators of stories, or, as I say, very different too from a purist, unemotional aesthetic response to an object. Instead, this is about a kind of response that falls into a space maybe somewhere between those two extremes, a space where, although we recognize that context matters, we don't lose the thing. The things don't dissolve into meanings. The emphasis on context, in other words, is prevented. It's not removed, but it's prevented in some way from inhibiting our opportunities to engage with things, even, as I say, those we might know nothing about, or we might initially know nothing about. And just to give you a very brief example from my own experience of this happening, and I'm sure this has happened to all of us on different occasions, and it might not have happened very often. It doesn't always happen very often, and it wouldn't happen for all of us in response to the same object. But for me, this is an example of it happening very recently. I went to Compton Verney Art Gallery, which is an art gallery in an old country house in the middle of the countryside near Stratford-on-Avon in the English Midlands. And I walked into a room which I later found out what kind of objects were in that room. But when I first walked in, I didn't know what was in the room. There was nothing to tell me at the door. I hadn't read anything or a guide that told me. I didn't know what kinds of objects I was confronted with. And right in the middle of the room as I walked in was this huge bronze horse on a plinth, in a glass case, standing alone in the middle of the room, and around the edge of the room were glass cases which contained other bronze objects which looked to be from a similar period and culture, but I didn't know anything about them. And this one in particular was just extraordinary for me to encounter physically. It was over 1 meter high. I just stood absolutely transfixed by it. I was transfixed by the color, by the shape, by the texture of the bronze. I could tell it was bronze looking through the glass. And I stood there probably for 10 minutes knowing nothing about this object and where it was from or how old it was or what it was. And I was literally almost moved to tears by it. I then, at that point, noticed there was a little number. There was no label in the case, no text panel. There was just a little number on the floor of the case, which I then went and picked up the hand guide to the room from the side of the room and was able to identify the text, find the text for this object. And it said, Han Dynasty, 206 BC to AD 220, Heavenly Horse, Tianma, bronze. This large horse would have been a funerary offering for the tomb of an elite Chinese man, the intention being for the owner of the tomb to use the horse to pull his chariot in the afterlife. Such large bronze horses were very rare during the Western Han period, becoming more popular during the Eastern Han. It was extremely difficult to produce such large bronze figures in one mould. Therefore, this stallion is cast in 9 close-fitting pieces and joined together, an expensive method in terms of labour and material. And that was it. Well, having been bowled over by the object before I knew anything about it at all, which was a response that Greenblatt would characterise as wonder, I then felt bowled over all over again, even more so, to then learn how old this thing was, that it was 2,000 years old. That in itself was amazing to me. I was fascinated by the fact that it was made of 9 pieces and tried to see if I could spot them all and find the joins and count the pieces. I was also moved again by the fact that it was a funerary object, actually, and that in itself seemed to connect me with a sense of humanity of the person at whose death it would have been used, even though that was 2,000 years ago. So I hadn't lost the amazing and powerful response that I first experienced. And I first experienced that powerful response, I think, because there was nothing there to inhibit it. So for me, because there was no text panel and no label there, I was able just immediately to engage with the physicality of that thing, which I found incredibly moving in itself. Then I was able to explore the context, the information I was given about that object, and that in itself was even more moving and powerful, and just added to the experience, and is what Greenblatt would call resonance as opposed to wonder. So my point in telling that personal experience is that there is a value in the fundamental emotional, even visceral response to an object in and of itself, as well as the role of that response in helping us to empathize with and to understand more acutely an object's history. So the opportunity to be moved to tears, tickled pink, shocked, puzzled, whatever, even disgusted by an object, in itself is a powerful component of what a museum experience can offer. It is a very powerful step on the journey to cognitively understanding that object and what it has to tell us about history or whatever, but it is also something that is important in its own right. It's a potent and potentially transformative experience in its own right. Now, lots of us wouldn't question that kind of claim if we were just talking about art, especially conceptual art. So it's fairly... it's not difficult for us to accept that the role of a lot of those kind of objects is precisely to provoke or amuse or puzzle or disgust or wow us in some way. We accept those kinds of elemental impulses as being of value in their own right. We even accept that in a totally different context to museums, in our consumption practices in everyday life. And of course, the kind of visceral emotional responses we might have to objects that might make us want to acquire them, to buy them, is something that gets exploited by advertisers and retailers all the time. But those kinds of responses and what their value might be in a museum context perhaps can be extended and thought about further. Objects matter within museums, of course, but so often, as we've said, they feature as merely illustrations of stories to be told, rather than powerful items in their own right as well. The effect that it's expended by museums to render objects and interpretation accessible, the work that gets done to enable visitors to identify meaning and context, all that's really laudable and really important. I'm not in any way trying to undermine that. But so often the very strategies entailed in those processes can prevent or undermine those other possibilities, those other kind of powerful possibilities that we can have in theory by going to visit a museum. Museums, I think it's very difficult to think about how one could translate that into practice, because I think it's hard. Museums can't necessarily predict or effectively enable a powerful response to objects, because those responses are often very personal. They don't happen for all of us all the time, and they won't happen for all of us with the same object. So lots of you may not have felt moved by my Chinese horse at all. But I think perhaps if objects are placed once more at the heart of the museum endeavour, and if museums work to avoid inhibiting the possibility for emotional and sensory interaction, if they think a little more closely about what happens and what might happen when people encounter objects on display on a sensory and emotional level, if they ponder a little more what it might be like for visitors more often than not to be able properly, bodily, emotionally to engage with an object rather than look at it half-heartedly after reading a text panel on a wall or a label in a case, then possibly those possibilities, those opportunities will remain and will be a little more open than they so often are. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
So would you like to take any questions?
If anybody wants to ask any, that's fine.
Hi, I don't know exactly if you'll be able to answer this, but I was curious about the Australian Museum, if you had read any reviews or if they'd gotten any feedback about how effective those exhibits were.
I'm not sure if they've done any extensive evaluations yet. It might be a bit early, but I don't think that if you were really interested, I don't think that they would mind at all if you emailed them to ask, because I think it's something that they will be very keen to do proper evaluations of that. I have seen one review, I'm trying to remember where I saw it, which was a positive review, but I haven't seen many others. I think it's pretty early still for them. Yeah.
Not quite sure how to put this, but it seems that the thesis that you put out, which makes a lot of sense to me, that the object itself is almost the principal thing before you learn about the context and the story and so on. But that must be a function of its function. To the extent that we're in an archaeological museum, a historical museum, that's extremely strong, I believe. That is, you can look at things and say, wow, that's beautiful. And you say, gee, I wonder what it is. Yeah. If you go into an art museum, you very rarely ask that question, I wonder what it is. It's a piece of art. And so you don't worry about the context and the history. You just look at it and you either like it or you don't like it, you get moved by it and so on. So where do things break down? Can you distinguish between art museums and archaeological museums and historical museums, or are you talking about the whole spectrum?
I think I'm talking about the whole spectrum. I completely understand what you're saying, and I wouldn't disagree with you. But I think that there is, with an archaeological object or an ethnographic object or a natural history object, there is still the same. It doesn't mean that then asking what's it for or where's it from is in any way erroneous or kind of limiting of the experience of the object in itself, but that you can still have, of course it doesn't always happen, but it's still possible that you can go into an archaeological museum or a natural history museum and see something that you have no idea what it is. It might be a millstone, and it's just amazing because of the shape and the texture, and it just strikes you as this extraordinary physical thing, which it has a beauty of its own, and it has something like that has a very strong tactility as well. That in itself kind of draws you in, and then enables you to then be even more kind of hopefully engaged by then learning about what it is and where it's from and so on. Does that sort of respond? So what I'm saying is not, I wouldn't say it was different for different kinds of objects, if that is your question.
I guess I was looking at the counter argument, which if you have an art museum, you don't want anything other than that visceral and aesthetic reaction. Not that you don't want, excuse me. That's not the major point. The point is...
yeah, I'm not sure that I would agree with that, but... Yeah.
Hi. From your perspective, can restoration or the lack of restoration limit the sensorial experience with the work of art or with the work?
Can it limit the sensorial experience?
Yeah, from your...
I think that's an interesting question. I don't know whether it would necessarily limit it, but I'm sure it can change it. So to overly clean an ethnographic basket, for example, you are going to change something that's very evident in the directly discernible material qualities of that object. So it's still a basket, it still has the texture of a basket, but perhaps it's lost something else which may not have just been visually evident, but may in itself been a textural thing, for example, in the way of ethnographic dirt or traces of things that the basket had held. If a basket like that is overly conserved, so those traces are lost, it may still be an interesting object that you can respond to, but in a way that's different from how it was prior to the conservation. But it doesn't necessarily limit it, I don't think.
Yeah, because the way I see it is sometimes it can enhance a different type of approach to the object, may diminish the historical view, I mean, one's historical perspective or the history of the work when one sees it, but it might enhance the aesthetics of it.
Yeah. Yes, it could do, because it could make it look more beautiful, which on one level would kind of perhaps be an enhanced direct engagement with the object, I guess, yeah. But it's only enhanced if you think that initial engagement is just about objects making you say, wow, because they're beautiful. And I mean, that was the example I gave of the horse, but of course they don't have to do that because they're beautiful. They can do that for other reasons as well.
But at the same time, it can enhance your vision on the texture, because sometimes it can be hidden under, a crust of...
Yeah, it could uncover or allow you to see other material qualities that in themselves would be of value in your experience of them. Yes, I agree. But it wouldn't necessarily be better or worse than how it was before, in my view anyway.
But it changes, it changes the experience.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to how you would respond to the kind of the earlier way of museum exhibits that would exhibit a number of artifacts together so that you can compare one to the other without necessarily having any context. Can you just respond to how that fits in?
Well, having worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum, I understand what you're asking. It's an interesting question, actually, because I think maybe one of the things that it leads to, for me, if I were to extend, and I didn't talk about juxtapositions of objects at all, I just talked about objects as singular entities in the argument I was trying to make, but your question kind of enables us to extend that a bit, and I think for example, you could have that kind of initial, powerful, sensory, physical, emotional response to a set of objects. It might not necessarily just be to one, or it could be to one, which is in a very crowded case, but it could also be to the overall impact of that group. And that also could be functioning at that same kind of pre-context level and still be quite a powerful, valuable process in itself. Is that kind of what you were meaning?
Yeah, it just led me to think that maybe, maybe there's a possibility for swinging back in our museum exhibits to doing both kinds of display, both comparative kinds of displays as well as contextual.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's scope for all sorts of kinds of display. I personally just want museums to remember they're about objects. And that's what makes museums special, that's why they're not the same as the internet or TV or, whatever else. They can do lots of the things that those other media can do, and they can do them better, but they can also do something else that is about informing people, and it's about educating, but it's also something more than that, and it's about magic. It's a kind of magic and mystery that I just feel so often you go into museums and it isn't there. And it seems really sad to me, because it seems such a wasted opportunity when there's all those beautiful things or fascinating things.
Yeah, I find the argument very compelling, specifically the aspect of engaging more of the senses other than just sight in museums. I've got a very practical question, sort of the elephant that's in the room. It has to do with the tension between access and conservation, preservation of the object. Have people been thinking about strategies for being able to deal with that tension that exists? Because the issue of access, of being able to touch objects, even being able to smell objects, being able to take objects out of that hermetically sealed case, has serious implications with regard to the conservation, the preservation mission that many museums have.
Absolutely. I think clearly it's a really important point, because that obviously keeping those objects safe is an important part of the museum's mission. I think there are kind of a number of different strategies that people have tried to draw upon in order to overcome that to some extent. So, for example, the kinds of things that Wenner and Sia did with the Australian Journeys exhibition, and having the idea of sensory stations where it may be actually that the thing you are able to touch or smell or taste is actually not the accessioned museum artifact that is in the display case, because for the reasons you've outlined that wouldn't be possible, but that sometimes it's possible to, in the case of smell, for example, to reproduce that in different ways, and in the case of touch, to have reproduction objects that at least allow you to kind of sense the tactility that is there in the museum artifact. Of course, what it doesn't do is it doesn't allow you to, it's like with Henry VIII's seal that I showed, it doesn't allow you to think, wow, I'm holding this thing that Henry VIII held. You don't have that kind of frisson to it, but that you can still have a sensory picture to an extent of what that object is about. There are also, I know there are people who are working on, I think I might have mentioned it earlier on, working on digital technologies to simulate smell, but also touch, and other kinds of sensory experiences. But the other thing, and I didn't really talk about this, but the other thing I think that is a kind of response to that question aside from how you can simulate or reproduce things, is that people imagine. If you can facilitate a certain degree of imagination and of empathy with an object, it's not the same as being able to wear it or hold it or whatever. But it's something that we kind of all do subconsciously and we take for granted, but that sometimes I think the museum setting actually inhibits us from doing. So, for example, when you look at an oil painting and you see its textured surface that you can see because of the way the light falls on the paint, and you can see that it's kind of three-dimensional. I can't touch that painting, of course, but I can and I will almost automatically imagine to some extent what that might feel like if I were able to touch it. I might never have stroked an oil painting in my life, but I can still, to some degree, imagine what it might feel like. I might be wrong, like with the walking stick. I might get it wrong, but in a way, maybe that doesn't matter, because it's still taken me further towards actually having an intimate engagement with the object, even if it's only an imaginary one in that case.
So it's kind of a virtual reality of a sort.
Almost, yes. Yeah, almost. It draws on, I think that's interesting because that's opens up a whole other set of things to do with how we imagine and how we remember as well. So sensory experiences we may have had with other kinds of objects in the past, how we draw on those to construct our experience now each time we perceive a new object in itself is something that's quite interesting, I think. Thanks.
Okay, since there are no other questions, again, Sandra, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.